Welcome back to another episode. I'm Kyle. This time we're going over a second half of 2019 wrestling photos. Check it out. So yeah, this is the second half of 2019. If you're tuning in for the first time, you can check out episode 1 in the link right below. That went over January through June, both WrestlePaloozas actually. And actually the second half of 2019 ended up being almost a little crazier than the first half was. July started off a little slower. There were a couple outdoor shows. We had the Whiz Bang show in Robbinsdale. That was a lot of fun. And then the second half of July really kicked in. And luckily I wasn't working as much for my regular job, so I had a little more time to take off and do some wrestling stuff. One of those included a trip down to Des Moines for the Wrestling Revolver, thanks to Chris Manning and Michael Watson for, shouting me out and saying like, no, he can handle it. Because Chris wasn't able to make the show. Michael was backstage doing his portraits and doing a couple shots here and there. So we didn't have somebody ringside the whole time. So I was able to come down and hopped in the car, came down. Because it was my first time shooting there and I knew they were broadcasting live, I didn't want to use a flash at ringside at least. So my ISO went a little higher up than I normally like, but I think I got a lot of cool images still because the lighting was really interesting, including one photo of Jessica Havoc sneaking up on Darren Corbin, and Darren Corbin's got this, oh no, she's right behind me, isn't she? Look on his face. So I got to do that. It was Caleb Conley versus Andy Dalton in it was a fans pick the weapons match, which fans could vote online from where they were streaming. And I got a couple cool images. Luckily, even though my ISO was really high, my shutter speed was also very high. So I got to capture all the particles breaking up of the light tube that Caleb Conley busted over Andy Dalton's head. And then, I got to also get this Cannon, Mance Warner, and Manders spitting beer out, and I got to capture the particles and everything really well because of the high shutter speed. But then I did end up having to use the flash for a couple of things because the main event was a big brawl between OVE, the complete crew of OVE, of Sami Callihan, Madman Fulton, Jake and Dave Christ, taking on Rhino, Eddie Edwards, Tommy Dreamer, and Jimmy Jacobs. So I got this cool shot of Sammy. He'd given a kick. I think speed, usually with that flash, is 1/3200th of a second. And luckily I've been shooting with that flash for a while. Like I said, in the last episode, it's a manual flash. So I don't have a TTL capabilities on it. But I kind of like that because I know I've used it long enough that I know the settings that I need to make it, amp it up. And then literally that day we went down to Des Moines, came back, got back at 4 or 5 in the morning. I then went and picked up Rob Page and Scott Story, and we headed up to Tower, Minnesota for Heavy on Wrestling's Fortune Mania 2 event that Sunday. So we got there the Saturday because it was an afternoon show and it was a 4+ hour drive. Sunday it's raining, which actually led to a couple cool shots. It's like this entrance for King Leonidas, actually being able to see the rain droplets. And since it was an outdoor show, I got to lower my ISO, but my shutter speed was still cranked up, so I got to capture the motion really well and freeze those little moments. But yeah, the higher shutter speed meant I could capture the action a little bit faster, and I was able to get, kind of cool shots of Ultimo Dragon and Super Crazy. I love Super Crazy. Super Crazy was so cool. Ultimo Dragon. signed that back there. There was also women's action on the show. Paranoia teamed up with ODB to take on Tara, Victoria, Lisa Marie Varon, and whatever you want to call her, and Brooke Valentine. The main event was Airwolf and JDX and Nathan Edwards in a triple threat match for the brand new Heritage title for Heavy on Wrestling. And then we got like 2 real quick shows in a row for First Wrestling. The Uptown VFW show was on August 2nd. And here's one of the highlight shots. Priscilla Kelly versus Kimber Lee. Fantastic match. Right after this, Darren Corbin speared both of them because he's a dick. But yeah, this was like PK and Kim are both so good. Orange Cassidy also on the show. Always fun seeing Orange Cassidy. Literally 9 days later, we're back at the Bauhaus show for Blood, Sweat, and Beers Volume 2. And kicked it off with Devon Monroe versus Kyle Pro. Devon makes his entrance. I was still kind of dialing in my settings at that point. And still a little bit higher of a shutter speed to capture the action, and then lower ISO, capture the action, and also reduce the shake. But it's a nice balcony, like it's a canopied area at Bauhaus, but the natural daylight still comes in. So I was able to get a lot of cool shots, and it's nice and even lighting the whole time. Except for when the sun starts setting and you can see it in the very far end. Yeah, we had so much talent on that. Solo Darling versus Paranoia. Got a cool shot of Solo doing a tornado DDT. This was Kip Sabian and his debut for First Wrestling. Really, really cool. We'll see in Kip. Kip, this was right when he was transitioning into being a heel, so he was mocking JDX, and JDX, rolls his fists and claps, and then you see Kip just being an all-around jerk. But he was so good. One of the highlights for me, I've always loved the work of Jimmy Havoc, and Jimmy finally was on a show that I was photographing, and it was Jimmy Havoc versus Eric Cannon. Really bloody match. Was a really good match too. Like, it was really good hardcore match, and I got a shot. Like, there's a couple standout ones. Cannon licking the staple gun as he's about to staple Jimmy. One of the multiple times that he stapled some form of currency to Jimmy Havoc. And then the last year, like I said, this was Blood, Sweat, and Beers 2. The year before, we had Tommy Dreamer. And it was Tommy Dreamer and Cannon versus Darren Corbin and Lore. And I got this shot of Tommy on top of the tables in the Bauhaus brew room. And he, being Tommy Dreamer, does the crucifix pose. I got a shot of him from behind with the crowd. I was able to replicate that shot this year with Jimmy, but I did it with my film camera. 400 ISO black and white film on a little crappy, I think I literally bought this camera for $30. But it's still one of my favorite shots because of that story behind it. And then also, like, Darren Corbin and Lore were able to take on, were back and took on Glacier and Gangrel, which was a lot of fun. And check out Darren Corbin's Patreon if you want to hear him tell some fun stories about Gangrel and working with him at Paragon Pro Wrestling. And yeah, the year just kept rolling on. I was able to do a show for Crush Pro Wrestling that featured D'Lo Brown, and you're looking at the real deal now. D'Lo, super down to earth, a lot of fun to be around. And then Pro Wrestling Battleground did a cage match, a cage show There were 2 cage matches. The first one was a 4-way Riley Jackson, Levy Cruz, Angel Dorado, and JDX. I hate cage matches. They are awful. They're incredibly hard to photograph. I hate them. I hate them. I hate them. The chain link fence is so hard, and it's like, you know, getting this pattern in front, and then you're trying to focus on something in the back, and the camera wants to focus on. So you've got to be very precise on where you're shooting towards and where your focus point is, and it really messes it up. And like, there's a couple, you know, cool shots, but for the most part, that's always a difficult setup. And then in October, I was back for Heavy on Wrestling. This time I was testing out a new lighting scheme. I had one of my remote flashes is up in the balcony, and was triggering it with my cheap little remote. With that, I was able to, because it was just flashing hard. I had to lower the shutter speed, obviously, to compensate for the sync, but because of the flash, it was freezing the action a little bit better. But you also get those harsh shadows if you don't have the light correctly in the right spot. And with wrestling, it's always very difficult because you can't like pinpoint. It's like, I'm going to make sure it's going to be right here every time. You have to, you know, your subject's going to be moving around a 18 by 18 in square at that point. But I was still able to get a few really good quality shots. And the reason that I got that I was setting up for those things was a gig later on in the month. So I was testing out. So I got a couple cool shots of Angel Dorado. And then Eric Cannon and Darren Corbin were in the main event. Cannon bleeding all over the place again. But then I was able to test that same lighting setup at Showtime Pro Wrestling and now Higher Ground Pro Wrestling. And I got a nice shot of Airwolf and Devon Monroe, you know, using that same setup. But the reason that I set that up like that was because I was fortunate enough to get a gig for FSCW, Fantasy Super Cosplay Wrestling, for their GalaxyCon Minneapolis event. And this was super cool. Like, it's pro wrestling, and it's a nice mixture of wrestling and comic books, which that's my comic book shelf back there. And so like I loved every minute of these 3 days that I was shooting. I was fortunate enough to get the gig because their main photographer, Speedy, actually works for AEW. And it was the same weekend as AEW Full Gear. So Speedy was needed to do that. So they had a need for a second photographer. Jason Cade is portraying Miles Morales, Spider-Man, and, you know, got a big os cutter off the top. Shooting Star Press. You know, I loved this lighting setup because, like, not only did I have my 2 flashes on each corner that I was using for the syncs, but they had a full-on lighting grid. I actually took a few shots with just their lights, and they were turning out pretty well. I wasn't feeling it quite as well as with my flashes, and it gave it a different look that I really liked. Lucas Calhoun for these shows is Wreck-It Ralph. So he had his hammer, and he had a water bottle, did the entire Triple H entrance because Wreck-It Ralph, much like Triple H, is all about the game. The highlight, though, of that entire weekend, though, because this was right before she debuted on AEW TV, and it was getting to see Chris Statlander live. Chris Statlander portrayed Rogue on these shows and had 3 really fun matches. The first one against Kira Hogan. No, the first one against Diamante at night 1 as Melina from Mortal Kombat. Night 2 was my favorite match of the entire weekend. Was Kimberly versus Chris Statlander. Kimberly was Mystique, and then Chris Statlander was Rogue. So we got a lot of Rogue trying to steal Mystique's power, and Mystique had some shape-shifting abilities, obviously, and we got to play with that. Shape-shifted into a couple other wrestlers, and then Rogue stole it, shape-shifted into a couple of the good wrestlers, and then won the championship after 450, which that one might be one of my favorite shots that I got, is Statlander's Area 451. And then we were back for First Wrestling end of November, making the debut at the Fargo venue, the Sanctuary Event Center. It was a lot of fun shooting there. It was a different lighting setup, so we got a couple cool shots of Joey Ryan's entrance, still using the flash. And then same with Orange Cassidy. Orange Cassidy coming out. And this was actually a little tease because Priscilla Kelly was not on this show. She was on the next night. But Priscilla had come in early. And so OC is wearing the Priscilla Kelly t-shirt of the photo that my friend Michael Watson took. So that was a lot of fun. And then this one, I like this photo from the next day at the Uptown VFW just because of the story behind it. And it was Joey Ryan versus Devon Monroe. And Devon's been wrestling a couple years at this point, 1.5, 2 years. But just immediately just comes off the screen every single time, and is very charismatic, and just you want to watch them. Joey's wrestling Devon, and after the match, because this was the end of November, the January WrestlePalooza show had already been announced, and Joey's grabs the mic, Devon, are you booked on WrestlePalooza? Devon shakes his head, no. You are now. I'm gonna make sure that happens. So yeah, Joey Ryan's responsible for Devon Monroe's WrestlePalooza debut. So that was super cool. Darren Corbin, he wrestled Tommy Dreamer on this show, defeated Tommy Dreamer, does the crucifix pose up in the entrance to close the show off. Great shot. Corbin, you're a jerk. That being said, I also he is one of my best friends, so I always enjoy photographing Darren Corbin. I mean, he's kind of the reason I got into this whole wrestling photography thing. So I got to do a couple cool shots of him. He had just gotten married, and as he's teaming with Lore for a Showtime show, he gets in super close to my face. But luckily, since I was using the off-camera flashes, I didn't blow him out completely, and I just gotten my focus, my lens calibrated again, so everything was tack sharp, and I got to see his wedding ring in this shot. And then the reason that I included the Devon Monroe entrance photo from the Bauhaus show is then later on in the year, Elena Black uses that same photo that Devon now sells as an 8x10, pick it up, as her little voodoo sacrifice altar. She is the sorceress of sin, after all. So that was cool, a little photo inception there. And then the last photo that we'll talk about is the Hanukkah Havoc show back at the Temple of Aaron Synagogue, where we closed off the last episode. Probably my favorite match of this entire year, that being David Starr versus Matt Sydal. The two of these guys are so incredibly good in the ring. Words don't do it justice. There's a link below to the match itself. Like, it was just very good, hard-hitting, pure wrestling match. So make sure, thank you everybody for checking out this video. Make sure to like and subscribe below. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at KnockedOutFilms. Check out everything else at knockedoutentertainment.com or knockedoutfilms.com. Thank you.